Hello everyone, Darren Rawlings for Emerging Civil War, and you join me here at Petersburg National Battlefield, and it is the anniversary of the Battle of the Crater. 160 years ago today, the Battle of the Crater took place. But how did we get to the crater? I'm going to bring on historian Tim Wilgin to tell you about how we get to this point.
Hi. So as most probably know, the Battle of Petersburg, or Siege of Petersburg as some call it, came at the tail end or immediately followed the Overland Campaign. Ulysses S. Grant's efforts to get around Robert E. Lee's army, bring him to battle in the open, out of his original mine run defense lines. First they had the Battle of the Wilderness, and they had the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. He then flanks around, moves to the left, fights at the North Anna River. Then you have the Battle of Cold Harbor, which lasted until roughly the middle of June. Then Grant masterfully extricates himself from the Cold Harbor line, moves across the James River, and launches assaults on Petersburg 16 to 18 June. Those assaults, initially successful, ultimately do not capture Petersburg, which was a major transportation hub for the Confederates, feeding Lee's army and the Richmond defenses. That basically, Lee's forces basically move from the Cold Harbor area, are able to reinforce PGT Beauregard's Department of North Carolina and Southern Virginia here at Petersburg. And we are now locked into static trench warfare, just like they had been outside Cold Harbor. So everyone's constantly trying to find an opening. Grant's trying to get around the flank, cut railroads, the Weldon Railroad, Jerusalem Plank Road, which is off to my right in the distance. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. To that end, Ambrose Burnside, commander of the Union 9th Corps, has an idea to basically to tunnel under the Confederate defenses. There's a salient off to my right called Elliott's Salient. Initially, Grant and Meade, still commander of the Army of the Potomac, they're both cool to the idea. But ultimately, they allow the plan to succeed, and the result of this mining operation will be the Battle of the Crater. So that's how we get here to this point, July 30th, 1864, when the mine is detonated.
So what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention to the crater now, because obviously there is an entrance to the crater, and we're going to go down there, and Tyler's going to explain how they tunneled the crater and what went on there. So I'll pass you over to Tyler. Tyler McGraw, the Unfiltered Historian.
Thank you so much. So we are here at the entrance of the mine. This mine is going to be the one that is constructed. Obviously, there's some new stuff today for you to look at, some interpretive tools, but this is the location of the entrance of the mine. So as early as June 17th, Henry Pleasants of the 48th Pennsylvania has come up with an idea to dig under the Confederate position, Elliott's Salient, which is just going to be directly behind or on top of this mine here. If you dig and place significant gunpowder, a lot of the gunpowder, 8,000 pounds worth, this can be exploded. And maybe you've given yourself an opportunity to get into this trench and attack the Confederates on the other side. So Pleasants will ultimately meet with Burnside. Burnside likes the idea, and it is set in motion. On July 27th, they receive 8,000 pounds of black powder to line 511 feet of a mine shaft directly under the Confederate works. So it's going to take a lot of manpower to build this. Obviously, again, I just mentioned it's about 511 feet long. The trench is going to be dug in the heat of the summer, and there's some concerns as they're digging as well with ventilation. As we move forward, I walk up the hill. Eventually, I do want to point out the ventilation shaft, which is still visible to this day, but that's something that's going to be constructed in this mine to allow them to breathe a little easier and to have some room to work and move. Building this mine doesn't go without alerting the Confederates. In fact, there are 2 attempts at a countermine built, and this is going to cause a delay around the 18th and the 20th, somewhere in that time frame, that there's actually going to be a halt in work with the Union forces here because they don't want the Confederates to detect their digging. Those are known as countermining. If you stop digging altogether and they start mining and digging towards you, there's no sound of mining. maybe nothing going on. I think that's the mindset there. So the Confederate countermines ultimately don't continue. And when they stop, the Union Army does go back and dig this. This is going to be completed again in really ready to go with the gunpowder on the night of July 29th, and that requires the fuse to be lit. Darren, would you like to walk down and show them a little bit? All right. So, of course, none of this being original sandbags. You see the concrete and all the interpretive tools here, but it is great to come down here and really get an idea for kind of what the conditions were going to be when the 48th Pennsylvania started digging the mine.
It's very enclosed, isn't it? Enclosed space, and I bet it's awful down there, awful conditions.
Especially even today, I can only imagine. But you see how hot it is out here today. Just imagine.
I heard a story that they actually stripped their clothes off.
I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
I have not read anything yet just to corroborate that, but I can only imagine if you're working right in those conditions, you wouldn't want to be wearing much there in that regard. But you can see we have a little friend all the way back there kind of showing you what they were wearing. So put the camera in a little more.
Just a quick question, Tyler. So obviously they've mined it. So how much? Sorry, I know you said how much was going in there, but tell us about the circumstances leading up to lighting that fuse and you know so destroying the Confederate earthwork.
Absolutely, the fuse itself has to have some side of protection. So what they're going to do is wedge it in between some sandbags and actually some wooden boards to kind of keep it stable. And it's not a short fuse. If you think about it, this is again 510 to 511 feet long. You're going to need a significant fuse in order to detonate the black powder at the end of this line. So when they go to set the first one, the time for the initial blast was 4:30. That was the signal to assault. That was going to give Burnside's men over here the opportunity to get up out of the prone position and move up towards the crater. Now, at 4:30, nothing happens. They realize that somebody's going to probably have to check the fuse and correct that and fix that so that this can go off. And, of course, they do send some members of the 48th in. And at 4:44 a.m., the blast is heard. Men are going to get up and rush and attack the crater there. We're going to get there so I can explain a little more. But on this side, the Union Army do write about seeing arms, legs, and cannon flying high into the air. Some Confederates even say about 100,000 tons of dirt just thrown all over the place. So this is the initial reaction they're getting here laying at the entrance of the mine with that fuse. So that fuse does go out. It's got to be a dangerous job to go in there with the fuse out, having to go far in there, not knowing if it's going to blow or not, only to light it again at 4:44. It's going to go.
Okay, so we've moved slightly up, and we're following the line that the tunnel went along, and as you can see, it's gone in on itself. But Tim is going to explain a little bit about the next part of the story.
All right. So at about 4:45 in the morning of July 30th, 1864, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pleasant's mine is detonated. It is detonated right behind me. Right under Elliott's Salient, which is held by the 18th and 22nd South Carolina Infantry. Somewhere in the range of 280 to 350 infantrymen from those two South Carolina regiments are killed instantly, along with 19 members of Pegram's Battery, which is stationed in the same vicinity. Now, rewinding a little bit, Burnside's initial plan called for his 4th Division under Brigadier General Edward Ferrero to lead this assault. This was a division of United States colored troops. They trained for a couple weeks prior to the assault. At the last minute, Burnside briefed Grant and Meade the plan. For political reasons, Grant and Meade basically said that Burnside needed to change the assaulting unit to white troops. The reason they were concerned about this, they felt that if it got out in the public, they would basically say, oh, you just fed African-American troops in to be slaughtered. And it would be politically damaging to the Lincoln administration, especially with the election coming up a couple months later. So Burnside reluctantly points Brigadier General James Ledley's division, 1st Division, I believe, to lead this assault. They're not trained for it. They form up in between, if we can turn around here. Right there in kind of the middle distance, you can see a patch of high grass. That marks the Union picket line. Those would have been earthworks that would have shielded the Union troops from Confederate observation. Beyond that, you have a depressed terrain down that way. That's Poors Creek, and then beyond it, the rail bed of the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad. And off in the heights, you have Union fortifications, Fort Morton. Sorry. The assaulting troops line up basically between the picket line and the railroad. And when the mine detonates at 4:44, they rush out. Initially, there's 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery is one of the units. They rush up towards the crater, so they're moving off in this direction. So obviously, this would have been pretty noisy. At the same time, over 100 Union artillery pieces blast roughly 2 miles of Confederate lines, including in this vicinity, trying to soften up and ensure that any reinforcements are somewhat deterred. This area was right in front of me was the Confederate picket line. Likewise, they were sheltered behind earthworks. The Union forces would have, those who weren't killed, wounded, or otherwise discombobulated, for a better word, would have been pushed out. And then the assaulting Union troops would have come up to the crater left by the detonation of the mine. Now, the explosives had been laid out in a couple galleries or magazines at the end of the mine shaft, which would have been perpendicular to the original tunnel. And would have run directly underneath the lines. They emphasized like the sides. And it left a hole in the ground roughly 30 feet deep. I forget the dimensions of what, the width, a couple hundred feet. But rather than flow around the crater, with the objective of the assault being the Cemetery Hill area off of the Jerusalem Plank Road. If you look in the distance, you can see some trees. Right beyond those trees is the Jerusalem Plank Road. And off in this direction is a heights known as Cemetery Hill. That was the ultimate objective if they could do it. But when they get to this point, rather than seeing flowing around like Ferrero's United States colored troops had been training to do, the white troops rush into the crater and up the other side, thinking that it will make a natural earthwork. However, it's too steep, too rough, broken. The lithographic, I guess it's lithographic image on the other side is post-battle, post-crater. But you can kind of see it's really rough, broken, would have been slippery. There would have been obviously body parts, bodies in the crater, so rather horrific scene. So this is actually one of the sadder episodes of the Civil War, certainly of the Siege of Petersburg, Battle of Petersburg.
Okay, so I'm going to bring on Gina Denham now, and you may recognise Gina because Gina's been on the Emergency Civil Wars podcast a couple of times to talk about monuments for UK veterans of the American Civil War Association. And of course, Gina is a co-founder as well as I, and also your honorary secretary of the London branch of US Civil War veterans. But the Battle of the Crater and Petersburg, there were 2 Brits that died here during the battle, and Gina has dug up some information and she's going to tell you what happened.
Daz had given me, before we came out, a bit of a mission, and that was his words, he loves a mission, so I had to find some Brits that had come to America and died here. The Monumental Project is about those foreign-born soldiers who came back to Britain and died in the UK after the Civil War. So the first person I'm going to talk about is a guy called John Thomas Cartwright. Now, John was born in a place called Burslem in Staffordshire, England, in March 1830. His father, William, was a Methodist, and they were also a family of potters, and John followed into that profession. Now, in about 1857, he enlisted in the regular army, so he had a bit of military experience. But eventually, he then, once served in the Ohio units, National Guards, he then decided to resign his position, and he re-entered the regular army as a captain of the 27th US Colored Troops. And he was killed in the Battle of the Crater on this day. Now, we were really blessed, and I want to shout out to one of my friends, William Griffin, who's got the great website where he transcribes letters from the past, and I owe it to William for sparing and sharing the transcript that I'm going to read out. So, in a letter to his family, William's younger brother basically wrote about John's death. And again, I'm just going to quote this. It was past this Sunday that we heard John was killed. We could not credit it at first, but were afraid that it was true. One of our captains was going up to City Point, and he promised to learn all that he could about John. He came back the next day and told us it was true. So Tyler and I got a pass to go to the front. We saw the quartermaster, and he told us that John was killed making a charge on Saturday morning. The 27th US Colored Troop has 6 of 17 officers shot, and they think only one will get better. The rest are all dead, and it was a perfect slaughter. The 9th Army Corps did all the fighting. If they had been supported as expected, Petersburg would be ours. We have John's clothes, sword, and papers, which we will bring home. Your brother, William Cartwright. Shivers gone down my spine. But yeah, so that was John Thomas Cartwright. And there was another veteran called William Woodrow, or Woodruff, born in 1826. He was also born in the north of England in a place called Wirksworth in Derbyshire on February 7th, 1826. Don't know too much about William, but I wanted to kind of shine some light on his life. Now, apparently he died at the Battle of the Crater, and we've actually got images of the certificate of his death from the Adjutant General's office. And it says, I think it says 11 August. So we're not sure if he actually got killed or not, or maybe if he'd been a casualty of that. But yeah, 2 Englishmen. Darren had given me that special mission brief to find out. And as I say, we are Monuments for UK Veterans of the American Civil War Association. We do want to shine some light on those Brits. You can hashtag us, the hashtag, the Monumental Project. But we also felt that we are English born, and we are here today on the anniversary of the Battle of the Crater. And I just felt it important just to remember William Woodruff, 1826 to 1864, and John Thomas Cartwright. So may they rest in peace.
All right, so after Ledley's division comes in, there were other 9th Corps units also staged to support or follow up the attack. You had Orlando Wilcox's division, 3rd Division of the 9th Army Corps, and then off to the north in this direction you had Robert Potter's division. These are all more white troops. At that time, way back by the Taylor House or past the Taylor House was Edward Ferrero's division of United States Colored Troops, who, as I mentioned, had trained to launch this attack in the first place. So basically these reinforcing divisions, Potter struck kind of this part of the crater, the northern edge, and heading off in this direction. Wilcox's men came straight into the crater following Ledley's. But ultimately, finally, Edward Ferrero's unit division would also get involved, and finally the United States Colored Troops would be fed into the battle, crossing, moving down the covered ways, crossing the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad and Poors Creek, coming back up, following in the footsteps of the leading white troops. Some Union troops did actually proceed past the crater, past the Confederate line into this vicinity. The 2nd Pennsylvania Heavy Artillery was one such unit that suffered heavily here. Their line, based on their unit markers, you have a flank marker right here for their right flank, and down there at the end you may be able to see their left flank marker. suffered several hundred casualties, as was often the case with these heavy artillery units. You saw it at Cold Harbor with the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery here at Petersburg on June 18th, suffering the single largest number of casualties of any regiment during the American Civil War. These were units that were bigger than some brigades at this stage of the war. Most regiments by that point are a few hundred men. But bottom line, Union objective was to get off in that direction to Cemetery Hill on the Jerusalem Plank Road. In the distance, you may be able to see cars passing. That is the Jerusalem Plank Road. That was their objective, but the Union attacking 9th Corps divisions really don't proceed much past this point, at which point they're hit on all sides from Confederate artillery, infantry, and finally from a unit under a division under General William Mahone. To talk about that, I'll bring Tyler back on, and he'll discuss the Confederate counterattack here at the crater.
Thank you, Tim. So obviously Lee's not going unawares of what's happening here at the crater. There's this large gap in the lines created by this explosion, so obviously something's going on. And what Lee's going to do is he's going to notify somewhat of a local by the name of William Mahone, who's from Southampton, Virginia. Coincidentally, there's a railroad just over this crater here. That is the Norfolk and Petersburg Railroad. Mahone was the president of that before the war. So he's got a little bit, I wouldn't say, big fight here. He doesn't have much into this, but it is the state of Virginia to him, so there's some heightened tensions, and Lee is personally going to find Mahone and have 2 of his brigades go. One of them, Weisiger, is in command of Virginians. The Virginians are going to charge across the field here to recapture the crater. At the time of the Virginian assault, this is roughly around 9 in the morning, so they're stymieing the attack that has been going on since, again, we mentioned around early 4 a.m., somewhere in that time frame. Ultimately, the Union Army is not going to be able to hold this position. The Confederate counterattack does stop the Union forces from gaining any ground here, and what we see is an absolute disaster. Out of the total casualties here, there are roughly 4,000 killed, wounded, or captured on July 30, 1864 here at the crater. The assaults done by Mahone, all the assaults led by the Union forces kind of ended at this spot on July 30. Again, roughly 4,000. The other thing that takes place is a very not so happy spot in American history, and that is unfortunately when some U.S. colored troops are captured by the Confederates. The Confederates were absolutely appalled that there were U.S. colored troops fighting, and this is the first time many of them were engaged, so the treatment of those colored troops were horrible, to say the very least. Some were killed in Petersburg. Others were killed by some of their own officers, fearing that if they would be captured, then they too would be killed for leading the troops. So the crater is a very rough place. 160 years ago, this would have been an absolute horrific place to be. So today that we were able to be here and commemorate this, and having the experience of commemorating some of the British folks here as well, this has been a very unique and powerful experience. And I want to thank you guys for having me, and also thanks everybody for watching this video today.
Okay, so that concludes our videos on the Battle of the Crater. Again, 160 years ago today. A massive shout out to the unfiltered historian Tyler McGraw for, giving us all that great information out there at the crater site. Historian Tim Wilgin, and of course Gina Denham behind the camera for telling us about the 2 Brits that fought and died at the Battle of the Crater. And yeah, so we decided to finish the video here at the visitor centre because we wanted to have a closer look at the stuff inside. What I would tell you, ladies and gentlemen, please come and visit the visitor centre here at Petersburg National Battlefield, because it's fantastic. There's a fantastic video about the history of not just the Battle of the Crater, but of course of the siege of Petersburg as well, which is 9.5 months. And yeah, so all that is left to say is I'm Darren Rawlings for Emerging Civil War at Petersburg National Battlefield. We'll see you online and on the battlefield. Cheers.